Welcome to this second lecture in sociology, which is about microsociology. As you remember from the last lecture, microsociology is the kind of bottom-up discipline in sociology that deals with individuals and their interactions, their bottom-up institution building. So today we will start again with a very simple example of what you may call the sociology of the elevator riding experience, also the mandatory reading for today. We will then go on with some more classical microsociological experiments, the so-called breaching experiments and conformity experiments of the 1950s and 60s, and the book Silence by Irving Goffman, which develops the notion of so-called total institutions. Last but not least, we will again zoom out and develop a bit our theoretical thinking in microsociology about different theories of institution and institution buildings. So let's start out with what you could call the sociology of the stranger. We, as we live in a big city like Berlin, encounter probably more people every day that we don't know than those that we do know. There's also this intermediate category of the so-called known strangers. When you commute regularly, for instance, you might see people on an everyday basis, even though you will never have talked to them. So sociology was also born as a discipline that was situated in large cities and started to think about this particular kind of abstract relationship that you have once you live in a place with the urban masses, where you are thrown out of your local village kind of context, where you knew everyone, you were sort of related to everyone, and encountered these situations of abstract interaction with many people that you wouldn't know. And one such very concrete interaction takes place in the elevator. Most of you probably have used this interesting device, and this is a particularly interesting situation because it basically forces people who don't know each other into a very narrow, very tight physical space where what Goffman called civil inattention is something like the guiding norm. And Hirschauer is a German sociologist who developed something like a sociology of this elevator experience. He also sent many of his students into different elevators to gather more data because I guess he wasn't able to ride the elevator himself most of the days. And I wanted to introduce microsociology a bit with this very concrete example. So the elevator is not something that has always existed. First elevators date from the 16th century European cities and were very far away from the ones that we use nowadays. These elevators, as we know them, developed basically with the invention of the skyscraper in the late 19th century. And the major innovation was the electrification of elevators. At first, it was a very particular experience where basically a chauffeur or the lift boys helped you get the elevator into motion. Nowadays, as you all know, this is an automated process. And as an urban setting, it's of particular interest. It's a place where nothing really happens. It's an eventless space in that sense. Marc Gauger also referred to this as a non-lieu, basically a space which is made for just being in transition to another place. So yeah, there's hardly someone who rides the elevator just for the fun of it. This also determines a bit how we use the elevator and which social norms are developed around this use. So the folk theory, that is the basic everyday kind of theory that we use, as Hirschauer puts it in elevator writing, is a rational choice one. We will learn later a bit what this implies, but this is basically that we regard elevator writing as just a means to get somewhere, and we want to minimize transportation time by doing this. We also expect others to act similar in these situations. It's a situation where we are forced to enter the role of participant observers. That is, we are ourselves under permanent observation and we have to participate, and there's hardly a way around participating ourselves in the observation. So participant observation is a technique also often used in microsociology, actually. It's the kind of technique that you use also in anthropology, or to get to know the everyday life of other people by participating in it. But in this particular elevator situation, everyone is a kind of sociologist, if you want. They are forced to participantly observe and be observed. Now, it's also interesting to think about the traffic rules that govern the elevator, and there might be differences, of course, between, I don't know, elevators in office buildings, in apartment buildings, in the United States or Europe. But I think a couple of these rules are almost universal. You correct me if I'm wrong. The first rule here that Hirschauer finds is that, well, passengers get out first until others move in. And the second rule then is that basically one goes in after the other. And those already in the elevator basically go out on a first on, first off kind of basis. The third rule is also that there's a certain queuing norm. So whoever has stood in front of the elevator longer in line is supposed to go in first. Once you enter the elevator, there are also certain rules. And I mean, the interesting sociological thing here is that these rules are not written onto the elevator, but they have developed over time in basically people socially constructing these rules of making use of this technical device. And the first such rule is that you face the door. So you won't face the mirror, at least not for very long, and not a non-mirrored wall, but you face the door. Another rule is the principle of what could be called equidistance. So once you go in, you make sure that you're not closer to one or the other, but that you keep sort of the same distance to everyone to not insinuate that you are somewhat closer to one of the strangers. And you might have noticed this yourself. It's very difficult to know what to do with your looks. And yeah, it's basically kind of unwritten rule to not stare at other passengers, to not look into their eyes, but to find a kind of resting place. So there's a certain eye discipline involved. There's also a relatively strong regulation about talking. Hirschauer talks about this concentrated silence with very few interruptions. And talking is basically down to very functional talk. The jokes might also just be functional and ease a bit the tension in the atmosphere. All of these implicit rules that sort of developed bottom up, right? No one sort of wrote a manual about how to behave in the elevator that everyone read beforehand. All of these rules then are made to sort of construct a situation in which it's fine for us to spend time, as short as it is, with strangers in very sort of close physical proximity. And one of the guiding norms is also to avoid acquaintanceship. There are probably very few acquaintances that started off in the elevator. So the main takeaway of this little elevator sociology was to acquaint you with some of the techniques also used in microsociology, which is to start off from very basic everyday kind of situations and to basically ask yourself how social life is being made possible in these situations, which are, again, not governed by formal laws or any formal rules. To find more out about these implicit rules that govern our everyday lives, sociologists since the 1950s have worked with a different kind of techniques, and two of these techniques I wanted to present here. The one is in the so-called phenomenological or ethnomethodological tradition, and this is the breaching experiment. The second one is more situated in social psychology. These disciplines were quite close still in the 1950s. And these are conformity experiments that you might have already heard about. Let's start with these breaching experiments. So the basic idea of people like Garfinkel or Goffman was to not just observe everyday life and see how rules are created, how social interactions take place, but to, in a way, actively find out about these norms by breaching them. And Garfinkel, for instance, again, sent out his students and just asked them to sort of breach a very basic norm in everyday life with their partners, their parents, in their families, to see how everyday life is sort of constructed and enacted. Here are some of these examples of the students' breaching tasks and some of the conversation that came up. Let's take case one. So, I had a flat tire. What do you mean you had a flat tire? So she appeared momentarily stunned. Then she answered in a hostile way, What do you mean? What do you mean? A flat tire is a flat tire. That is what I meant. Nothing special. What a crazy question. Case 2. Hi Ray, how is your girlfriend feeling? What do you mean, how is she feeling? Do you mean physical or mental? I mean, how is she feeling? What's the matter with you? He looked peeved. Nothing. Just explain a little clearer what do you mean. Skip it. How are your med school applications coming? What do you mean, how are they? Do you know what I mean? Well, you take a look at this book here by Garfinkel and look up some more of these cases. You might also just, go out to your everyday kind of situations and try out some of these breaching experiments yourself. So it's not a very experiment in the strict sense, in that there's no experimental setup, there's no control group, there is no stimulus applied, etc. It's more of an everyday kind of test, if you want. The basic idea is to confront the people that you know with a basic breach of the norm. Mostly you don't understand a certain notion, you just act abnormally to see what the reaction is. And as you already noticed in cases 1 and 2 here, there is a certain unease coming up in these situations. And some of the findings here of these experiments were that subjects reacted with real nervousness and anxiety. Yeah, they try to get back to normal somehow. They change topic, as you noticed in case 2, or yeah, they basically express their unease and show anxiety. And so that led Garfinkel, in its experience, to hypothesize that there's a very strong social construction going on for us to create a kind of everydayness with all of its implicit rules and norms that we also try to stick to in case something goes wrong. So these experiments worked with breaching a certain norm. They were simultaneously in the 1950s and 60s, the so-called conformity experiments going on. This time, real experiments, trial situations in artificial environments, mainly undertaken by social psychologists of the time. Here, one of the main goals was to see how subjects respond to pressure to act according to certain rules or norms. And I just wanted to present 2 of the most famous experiments, the Ash experiment and the Milgram experiment, that you might have already heard about. So here is one of the basic pictures that subjects in the Ash experiments were confronted with. So the situation is one where there's a group of 8 people and there's only one research subject, actually. All of the others, the 7, are actors. And all of these are given the task to indicate which of the lines here on the right-hand side correspond to the line of the same size on the left-hand side. So yeah, if I'm not mistaken here, the answer for this first little comparison here would be line 1. Now, it was not necessarily about finding out who is giving the right answers, but what this one research subject does in response to the 7 answers that all of these other actors had to say out aloud. The research subject not knowing that the others were actors, the research subject was made to believe that all of the others are also research subjects. In 2 trials, then the 7 actors answered the task correctly. In all of the 16 following rounds and trials, they intentionally gave the wrong answers. And the experiment was about seeing how this one research subject, having to give the answer after all of these other 7 answers, would respond to the obvious disconnect between what he or she was seeing on these pictures and the 7 previous answers. So here are the main results. In about 1/3 of all cases together, these subjects actually followed the actors and they gave the wrong answers as well. One should also mention that in at least 95 of all research subjects, they went at least once also against this great majority of the 7 and gave the correct answer despite of this majority pressure. So it's also interesting to look a bit at the variations of these experiments. If there was only one of the 7 actors defying the majority opinion, and particularly those actors with institutional roles. So someone, for instance, who was asked to switch on the lights, right? So who was given a certain task during the experiment. In these cases, then the subjects usually also went along with the minority actor against the majority. So the latter shows also the strong belief in institutional roles, I think. So the main interpretation that is usually taken from these experiments is to say that people tend to follow majority opinion and public pressure, even if they believe it is wrong. I think that this interpretation that is usually taken from these experiments should be a bit moderated. Please note that 95% of these research subjects voted at least once also against the majority. But this is generally to say that, yeah, in very local situation with a lot of group pressure, individuals are obviously influenced in their very fundamental opinions about the world by others in social interactions. So here comes the Milgram experiment, which is probably even more famous. And to introduce this, I would like you to go to this little YouTube clip of just about 2 minutes. You may also find some of the longer clips and watch these if this is of particular interest to you. Just a little warning issue here. Parts of this video might be a bit disturbing. The experiment involves also the application, at least the simulation of the application of electroshocks. So please take a look at the video and then we will be back in a second. So, yeah, welcome back. This experiment has been very famous, also even in popular culture, and it has also been quite controversial, not least because many of the research subjects after the experiments witnessed anxieties and they basically were tricked into a situation that proved very stressful to them. And it happened at a time when something like research ethics was still in the very, very beginnings. But the problematic nature of this experiment, mainly tricking subjects into a situation, they basically didn't give any consent to, and the negative consequences of subjects after the experiment also accelerated the process of bringing more research ethics into science. But let us also take a look at what this experiment actually does and shows. And there are different views on what is actually going on. I just wanted to present 4 standard views here following Hans Bernhard Schmid, a social philosopher from Vienna. And then also give you a little sociological, perhaps, interpretation of this experiment, which after all is in social psychology. So Milgram himself sold this experiment with the so-called situational view. He thinks that he found that even, normal people can be pressured into this harmful behavior, like the one that was present in the minds of many at the time, the concentration camps of the Nazis. And this may happen even without the use of direct force. A little bit of pressure from the researchers was enough to make normal people do basically crimes that they normally wouldn't have done. One obvious problem of this very common view, also proposed by Milgram then, is that, I mean, there were many moral heroes, if you want, in the experiment who defied the norm to obey the researchers and who just stopped and interrupted this experiment. A second view, also prominent at the time, follows up on Theodore W. Adorno's work from the 1940s and 50s on what was called the authoritarian character. Again, the puzzle in the room at the time was, how was it possible that a seemingly civilized kind of society like the German society was able to put up this barbarous regime of concentration camps, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. How was that possible? And Adorno's answer in his work is that there's something like an authoritarian character, just a certain percentage of the population that just waits for the right situation to realize this kind of sadistic character. The problem, again, with this interpretation is there's basically just one subject in the experiment for whom this interpretation might hold. All of the other subjects showed very serious signs of desperation and that inner troubles. Yeah, they were nervous physically, as you may have seen also in this little video clip. So yeah, this is like not a case of an authoritarian character, sadistic character who enjoys like this kind of situation. Then there's the obedience view. In the 1950s, there was also the idea that the Germans, for instance, followed a very obedient political culture, and that this kind of obedience makes people just want to follow orders, and they do whatever the order is. One problem with this interpretation for the Milgram experiment is that many of the individuals voiced their contradictory views. I mean, they basically didn't want to go on. They held different views on what should be going on in the trial. So not really obedient people, just following the opinion of the researchers. Then there's the simple pragmatic view. People just want to finish what they decided to start. One problem with that interpretation is that the subjects didn't really have an initial decision to go into applying electroshocks. And that, as you might have seen in the video clip as well, the subjects responded with an increasing even unwillingness to apply ever stronger shocks to the actors whom they believed were also other research subjects. So these four standard interpretations, the most prominent one probably being Milgram's, is they all have their problems, and Hans Bernhard Schmidt here in this book proposes what I think is quite a sociological take on the situation. And again, it's an interpretation of this kind of situation which sees it much more as a realization of everyday life and much less as this experimental model that social psychologists take it to be. So, I mean, just put yourself into this situation. You're asked by seemingly competent researchers to help them out, right? To cooperate in a learning experiment, right? To make the American schooling system a better place, a better learning environment. So you're basically asked to cooperate, and yeah, not surprisingly, I would say people start cooperating. They try to help out. I mean, they get a little bit of money out of the experiment, but most of them, Eleanor, in the experience, for instance, they have a teacher background, right? They're interested in creating better learning environments. So I think given this background, it's not surprising that people participated and also cooperated at first. And then I think it's also not surprising to see how basically their initial willingness to cooperate was more and more contradicted also with what they experienced during these experiments. Namely, you see there are obvious signs of physical and psychic distress, and they voice more and more moral doubts. Um, I would rather say that the experiment shows how human and even how morally sound many of these research subjects acted, given these very particular circumstances. So the main takeaway again here for our lecture on microsociology is that the everyday life, everydayness contains many, many implicit rules. The presence of other individuals influencing us can basically change our behavior quite a bit. And the sociologist's role in this microsociological perspective is to basically take an interpretative stance to understand what is really going on in these situations, and how are these norms and social rules constructed. Let me move on to a final example, also a bit extreme, by Erving Goffman, who is, by the way, the father of Alice Goffman, whom we encountered in the first lecture, with the work on the Run, the penitentiary system. And Erving Goffman also did a microsociology, but more of what he calls the asylums, or also total institutions. He spent about a year as a participant observer in a mental hospital at a time when life in mental hospitals in the United States was not very kind to its patients. His work also inspired then social reforms of these institutions. And in his work on these asylums, he developed this notion of total institutions, which he defines as a place of residence and work where a large number of like-situated individuals, cut off from the wider society for an appreciable period of time, together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. And as examples, you may think not just about asylums, but also homes for the aged or blind, or any other kind of patient group, mental hospitals, but also jails, concentration camps, army barracks, boarding schools. And these are just perhaps the extreme examples, monasteries as well, where you basically spend your complete time at this one institution, day and night, totally administered. But you may also add certain contexts, such as, perhaps cruises, going on a cruise, or any kind of situation where you are locked up for a certain time with the same group of people in the same space. And for these kind of institutions, which, if you want, are the most extreme case of how others microsociologically determine your everyday life, Goffman developed a couple of characteristics that I just wanted to introduce a bit to you. So a total institution, as we saw, is the situation where basically everything is at one place under one authority, right? You eat, sleep, work in a jail. There's a constant, basically, authority above you. And you're basically forced to share your everyday life with the other two major groups, which are the inmates and the staff. So Goffman basically develops this microsociology of the total institution through these two major roles which structure this institution by so much. Overall, there's a quite regulated notion of time in these institutions, right? And everything is organized also according to one rational plan. Usually, the ultimate goal is obviously one of rehabilitation, but the de facto reality is that, I mean, people are somehow locked up, and the staff basically makes sure that this remains the case. So let's start a bit with the inmates. So the inmates are locked up in this institution. They have a very regulated, if at all, contact with the outside world. There might be visiting hours. I mean, they have their beliefs, very stereotypical also about the employed staff. There are jokes about them, bad opinions as well. And the staff obviously has the same on the inmates. So the inmates are basically outside of their normal life. Yeah, they are not really at work anymore. They don't have the family life. Their roles, yeah, important notion also here. Their roles are basically reduced to this one single role of being an inmate. In this way, the life is much less segregated into different spheres of life, or there's little role differentiation going on, right? Think about your own life. You have different roles, right? You're like a friend, you're a colleague, you're like a romantic partner to someone, you're the son or daughter, and all of these different roles come with certain expectations, certain norms, duties that come along, and this variety of roles, this differentiation into different roles, with also conflicts between different roles. Right, you want to be, I don't know, a good son or daughter, at the same time also spend time with your friends, given a limited time budget. All of these conflicts, they are all gone in these total institutions by collapsing them into this one single role, which is the inmate. At entry into this kind of institution, you are also stripped of your civic rights, right? So you have to even give up certain possessions. Yeah, you lose some physical integrity. You lose your privacy. And yeah, once you're in this everyday life, there's also basically a new kind of social life being created. And there are basically two sources for this. The one is the staff itself creates a sort of privileged system. It makes it easier for the staff to govern the institution, right? It incentivizes perhaps cooperation, but also increases subordination of others. The inmates themselves also start to basically create a social order. They fill the void that this reduction to one single role has left them with. And there's a certain ranking. I mean, in prisons, this is probably quite known. There are gangs being created, and there's a strict sense of hierarchy and belonging to certain groups. There's also an interaction between this privilege system of the staff and this internal ranking that the inmates create. Goffman also observes that this nature of the total institution doesn't leave the inmates unchanged, and they develop different strategies to cope with basically this complete governance of everyday life. And these range from what he calls the situational withdrawal, right? So kind of escapistic, kind of inner rebellion, which might even move into this refusal, where there's open opposition also against the many rules that exist. But basically, this range of different strategies goes up until what he calls colonialization, where you start accepting actually the new order that you live in. And try to basically make the best out of it, if you want. And in the extreme case, leading even up to a conversion, where you accept the view of the staff. Yeah, you become the perfect collaborator, and you sort of give up your own views. So the role of the staff is described relatively shortly by Goffman, but they are engaged in what he calls the people work. They have to make sure that the basic humane standards are maintained while simultaneously coping with the inmates outnumbering them. And they have to devise sort of efficient supervision techniques. They have to go through quite complicated kind of situations. They are basically still in the outside world. Often they live outside of the institution, but they live close to it. They spend most of their working hours there anyhow. So it also doesn't leave them unaffected after all. So the total institution is, I think, an extreme case, also for that reason interesting to microsociologists to see how basically everyday life can be governed by others, by institutions, leaving to the extreme the individual very much exposed to the influence of others. Last but not least, I wanted to zoom out a bit and see a bit what we can theoretically take out of these many examples. And for this, I want to introduce the optional reading for today, that is Berger-Luckmann's The Social Construction of Reality, which develops a kind of theory of how these everyday kind of interactions, starting from the face-to-face interaction, create institutions, maintain these, how institutions then feed back on the individual, and how, from this bottom-up perspective, social order is created. So the summary sentence for and from this book is probably that society is a human product, society is an objective reality, and man is a social product. So this should be reminding you a bit of the Thomas theorem, right? We live in a social world that is constructed by ourselves. And this construction feedbacks on us, how we behave. So let's start a bit building up how the social world is constructed according to Berger-Luckmann, starting with this very basic face-to-face interaction. So imagine, for instance, you live in a flat share with other students, you basically live there as different individuals. And there's sort of an understanding of a division of labor, right? Everything needs to be cleaned every now and then, and things have to be bought, have to be organized. There might be like basically a coffee, shared coffee kind of institution, and you interact with the other students in sort of creating this everydayness. So you are the one, for instance, who always does the cleaning on Mondays, and George over there, right? He's the one who usually buys the new coffee. And gradually over time, this kind of interaction leads to what Berger-Luckmann call the reciprocal typification of habitualized actions by types of actors. So let's decompose this complicated statement for a second. So we have these different actors, right? There's George and me, for instance. And in our daily routines, we sort of developed, right, these habitualized actions. I do the cleaning on Monday, and George buys the coffee. And we do this for weeks going on. So in a way, it's sort of clear that basically there's this one actor doing this one kind of action. So I expect George to buy the coffee, and he expects me to do the cleaning. So there's a reciprocal process going on, basically a typification of these actions, meaning I'm sort of responsible now after all of these weeks for the cleaning. And George is starting to become responsible here for the coffee purchases, meaning there's the expectation growing, if you want. A local social norm is developing on this reciprocal basis. That these actions, these typical actions, are done by us. Now imagine that there are new members coming into this kind of flat share, or think about even, let's move this setting a bit to an organization, right? So George and I also work in this Berlin startup. After having been there, and I've always done the cleaning, and George has always bought the new coffee, we are sort of done with a startup. We move on to the next one. Basically employer of this startup now needs to fill in the roles of the cleaner and the coffee purchaser, as George and I have left the company. Now, you see, I already talked about these two positions as roles, right? So roles meaning here, this is basically an institutionalized kind of attribution of many activities, expectations, responsibilities, but also freedoms that are not attached anymore to myself, but to this type of actor, right? The one who is in the position then to do the cleaning. And this is meant here with a notion of types of actors, right? So it's not any longer here about the individuals, George and me, doing certain things. It's about basically certain norms, expectations, duties attributed to these abstract roles, these types of actors, which have to perform these actions. And out of these very everyday kind of interactions, then we see the emergence of something that Berger-Luckmann call objective institutional reality. And I introduced this through the example of roles, but you may also think about all kinds of other social facts, right? Remember from the first lecture, kind of social objective facts, right? The symbols, right? I might wear a certain company shirt, signs, traditions of any sort. Berger-Luckmann think that all of these objective features of social reality are produced bottom up through this very mundane, everyday kind of interactions, which gradually crystallize into these more abstract kind of norms and roles, etc. So that it's basically abstracting from the person who does it, abstracting even from the concrete action, such that, yeah, if you want, social reality becomes a kind of theater piece with scripts for all of the different participants. Now, you see that this kind of objective reality is put into place through the interaction of different subjects, which I refer to here simply as people or individuals having subjective consciousness. And in a way, this is created bottom up. So you see all of these arrows here pointing upwards, but you also see arrows pointing downwards. So the upwards process might be called objectivation of reality in Berger-Luckmann's terms. The downward arrows can be called internalization of norms. So let's get back to the Berlin startup. Now, the newly hired people, right, enter the two positions that George and I left vacant. They now are confronted with the script of cleaning the place and buying coffee. This might even be written like in a living document in the startup of how to do it. So they sort of have to internalize this objective reality to basically fill out these positions the same way we had done it before. This internalization comes here at a very late sort of moment in life. Obviously, these are already grown-ups, but also, I mean, think about it simply in terms of internalization of norms in the child-parent relationship or the school teacher-student relationship. Where also many more basic norms are internalized than those about how to buy coffee or clean the place. So then this kind of objective reality and its construction may take place in very many different domains of life. Yeah, the family, we had the examples here also from occupational life. But this objective reality is differentiated into the many different spheres of society. It creates also different knowledge repertoires in all of these different spheres. All of this is what Berger-Luckmann referred to as the first order of constructing reality. And this is distinguished from the second order. Which is the level of legitimization of the existing first order. So let's get back to the Berlin startup, right? The newly hired persons entering the startup. And now, I mean, one of them asks, I mean, why do I have to do the cleaning all by myself? Couldn't this be shared? This is the situation where the constructed reality on the level of the first order is confronted basically with the question of legitimization, so whether something is justified or not, on the second order. So according to Berger-Luckmann, for a first order construction, so this division of labor into different roles here in the example, to work, it also needs to be justified. And the moment of justification is often the one when new members enter a society or enter a local context. There's a second order construction of social reality, which consists of all of the different theories, justifications, even mythologies, ideologies that are made basically to make us accept the first order construction that we live in. So in the case of the Berlin startup, the employer might point to a certain social ranking, right? You have to start from the bottom and work your way up, which is a kind of meritocratic justification on the second order level for this first order construction, which is an unequal division of labor. So yeah, the second order constructions then, according to Berger-Luckmann, are necessary for the stability of our social world as well. They are also the place where in revolutions, counter ideologies, social order can break down. We had this case of money in the first lecture. If everyone starts to doubt that money or this paper here is a valid payment method, then this can lead to a disbelief in money and currency and eventually a breakdown of the social order. So the second order knowledge construction in society are also very, very relevant. Let us reflect a bit on the three major processes that are going on in this micro-sociological theory of how social reality and institutions are built according to Berger-Luckmann. That is the institutionalization, also called this objectivation, and second, the legitimization, and third, the socialization or internalization. So institutionalization is the process through which these supra-individual entities, right, these roles, these scripts, these organizations are put into place by the members through these habitualized processes of reciprocal typification. And this institutionalization probably takes place at the very moment when these institutions gain what is often referred to as this reality sui generis. So this kind of independent reality for the members. And one moment is when a child, for instance, is born into a social order. It is confronted with what seem to be these very permanent, eternal kind of institutions that have always been there. They might outlive the individual. The characteristic of institutions in Berger-Luckmann's sense is the taken for grantedness. That is, you don't even think about these institutions. You sort of take them for granted. They're always there, and they are in the background. They make life possible. I mean, just think about the institution of language. Think about the institution of the central bank. They're only questioned if there are problems coming up. So institutions are important in social life, but they're also not the whole story. So many domains are perhaps fortunately not governed by these institutions directly. The total institutions that we encountered are an extreme case, but there are many moments also in everyday life which are not as regulated as these total institutions. We also saw that these institutions might differentiate into very many different spheres of society. So the kind of knowledge and scripts and roles you have here at university are a very particular, even isolated part of social reality. I mean, that many of your relatives might not even comprehend. So the knowledge about what a seminar is, for instance, is, I mean, a very particular knowledge of an institution that is not generally shared. Language, by contrast, at least the basic grammar and functionality is something that transcends many of these institutions. It's a very general, almost universal kind of institution. One other important notion I wanted to mention here is the one of reification. So reification of an institutional order takes place once individuals forget that the social order is something that is created by themselves. And when they even think that this kind, or they even accept that this kind of social order is basically justified to influence them. So one example here of the use of this reification is money. In the context also of Karl Marx theory, money is often called as a kind of reified social fact because people tend to forget that it is us who invented money as an institution and that it is basically us who also should be governing it. While at the same time, in many instances, we let our motives be guided by money, forgetting that it is us actually who should govern money and not money that should govern us. And there might be different kinds of reification, religious ones as well. But this is basically to say that the social order constructed in these everyday interactions can be, influential to such an extreme that members of society forget about it being basically artificially created, and that social orders can also always be changed. Okay, this was regarding the process of institutionalization, so the creation or objectification of this social reality. We saw also that once created, there's a problem of this reality being justified or not. And one important distinction here is the one between explanation and justification. So parents can explain how this social order, for instance, buying something in a shop, how that works. And this is basically an explanation of the social order, but they can simultaneously also justify the social order. They can basically transmit to children the idea that property values are justified, that you have to pay for the products that you see on the shelves. And both explanation and justification are part of the process through which, on a second order level, then the first order reality, social reality, is reaffirmed and also transmitted to the next generations. Legitimization of the social order, the creation, for instance, of narratives, right, or biographies, is also important for you to manage the different spheres, the different roles that you have in life, and also across your basic different time periods of your biography. So we are sort of in need of a consistent narrative to bring all of this sort of under one coherent sort of legitimate way of telling. Last but not least, socialization or internalization refers then to this process through which new members of society, could be children, could be newcomers, are sort of brought into this social reality put in place. And yeah, there's often the distinction between the primary, secondary, perhaps even tertiary kind of socialization, the primary one taking place at home with the parents as sort of the significant other, so the important reference point for children to develop their understanding of norms and rules. The secondary socialization taking place then at schools with teachers as sort of the significant other. Finally, also tertiary socialization going on even in your workplace. The time spent at workplaces shouldn't be underestimated of socializing also people into their tertiary roles, even though obviously they are already grown-ups at that time. So all in all, this is a very sociological take on how individuals interact, how institutions are built. And I wanted to oppose this quite sociological micro theory to one alternative, and that is rational choice, which you have implicitly already encountered in the economics lectures. So rational choice theory also exists in sociology and is basically an imported product. To put it nicely, some sociologists also talk about economic imperialism, where basically notions from economics invaded terrain that is usually considered as sociological. Think about the family, think about discrimination, crime, education, so typical topics in sociology, which through this economist Gary Becker have also been basically analyzed with this economic model of choice. So it's basically a theory of decision making, which follows quite a formalized approach, an ideal language approach, as opposed to what we just encountered as this sociological theory, which starts from just bottom up everyday life, uses quite everyday kind of notions as well. And the starting point for this rational choice theory, as you encountered it already in economics for the consumer, the household, the representative firm, for instance, is the individual decision maker who faces a choice problem under a given set of preferences and situational constraints, right? You have a certain budget, you want to buy different products, and rational choice helps you to identify the right set of products given the constraints, which is the market prices, and given your preferences for each of these products. For this model theory of action to work, you need certain assumptions. On the side of rationality, some important assumptions are that, well, your preferences should be complete. You should know basically about all products. They should be transitive. So if you prefer product A over B and product B over C, then you should also prefer product A over C. And they should be consistent. So you shouldn't simultaneously wanting product A and product non-A at the same time, which would be inconsistent. So these are purely formal criteria to define the rationality behind choice. Formal meaning they're not material, and material meaning they're not containing any, let's say, substantive ethical norms. So they're not saying anything about you being irrational when you buy weapons, for instance. So in rational choice theory, it's perfectly fine and rational for an agent to buy weapons if the agent prefers buying weapons over buying yogurts or whatever. So the only rationality assumptions are formal. They just are about consistency, transitiveness, etc. Other assumptions in the model are about the information that you need in order to make a decision. There's usually the assumption that agents have perfect information about all of the different characteristics of products, for instance. And if not, that they also have a very rational mindset about how to get new information with, I guess, a basic calculus of the sort that you stop getting new information once it becomes too costly to collect them. So once you have your preferences rationally in place and all of the information, then you also need certain probabilities about how to achieve different products. So how likely is it for me to really get product A or B? And this will determine also which outcome I will choose. All of this goes then into the so-called utility function. So this is basically the main motivation for these actors in economic context is seen as maximizing utility, given the constraints of limited budgets. So at the end, it is about inputting the goods, services, and actions that output of this formula produce then the highest possible utility for yourself. This is basically a kind of formalistic theory that is used to understand how people act in economic context when they choose different products. An extension of this theory is also called the so-called game theory. Game theory is basically about situations where these rational actors encounter other actors and where they have to act strategically. And it's an approach that was, amongst others, developed by John Nash already in 1950, where he wrote a 2-page dissertation on the topic in mathematics. And you might know him from this popular movie, A Beautiful Mind, which, at least selects certain aspects of Nash's biography to make a Hollywood movie out of it. In this context, it's more important to focus on some basic notions that game theory brings. So it was developed also in the context of the Cold War and the arms race. So keep this in mind for a second. So as I said, game theory moves from the rational choice context of one actor deciding about different options, for instance, different products, into a space where there are at least 2 actors. And the actors are also called the players in this game. And the game is defined by different payoffs. So what do I get when I do action A instead of B? The other actor in this game also has different potential actions. Let's say he or she has also 2 potential actions, also A and B, which makes basically me having 2 options, him or her having 2 options, creating a payoff matrix of 2 by 2. Depending on what the other player does, I receive a certain payoff. And I might choose different strategies depending on what the other player does. Dominant strategy here is defined as a strategy that I will always go for no matter what the other player does. And equilibrium in a game is reached when no player has a further incentive to change the strategy. Sometimes there's also a distinction between so-called Pareto efficient and non-efficient kind of equilibria. Pareto efficient equilibrium is defined as one where no player can basically improve her situation without another player simultaneously losing it. This might all sound a little bit abstract. Let's move to a concrete and probably the most popular example, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. Here is a little description of how this game works. So 2 men charged with a joint violation of law are held separately by the police. Each is told that if one confesses and the other does not, the former will be given a reward of 1 unit and the latter will be fined 2 units. Second, if both confess, each will be fined 1 unit. At the same time, each has good reason to believe that third, if neither confesses, both will go clear. So this situation can give rise to a simple symmetric 2-person game. It's not a zero-sum game with the following table of payoffs, right? The payoff matrix in which each ordered pair represents the payoffs to 1 and 2 in that order. So this is a representation now of this little game Here we have actor 1. Here we have actor 2. Both have the choices confess or not confess, and this is symmetrically so. The payoffs here describe the units mentioned in the example, and the first number refers then to the payoff of actor 1, the second number of actor 2. Let's move a bit into the perspective of actor 1 now. He has the possibility to either confess or not confess. So he starts thinking, what will the other player do? Will he confess or not confess? Let's assume he confesses. If the other confesses, we are basically just talking about this first column here. And our actor 1 compares -2 to -1, right? If the other confesses and I don't confess, I would be quite stupid. I would basically go behind bars or pay the fine, the highest possible fine in this game. So I rather also confess. Yeah, I also just move to the -1, and this is where I end up. Let's assume now that player 2 does not confess, right? Now player 1 thinks, well, I mean, if the other doesn't confess, I might also not confess. And then we are basically out, right? We don't even get any fine. But then player 1 notices that if he also confesses, he will basically get a benefit out of it. Instead of 0 fine, he will get like a 1 unit, basically earning this 1 unit from offering the confession. So this leaves us with a situation where no matter what player 2 does, player 1 will always choose to confess. And as this is a symmetric game, this also holds for player 2, which means that you see these arrows of preferences, both holding the so-called dominant strategy, will basically move up to the upper row and to the first column, and they will end in this equilibrium of both confessing. This is an equilibrium because, as you see through these arrows indicating the preferences depending on the choices of the other player, no actor has a further incentive to move out of this first cell of the matrix. It's not the optimal equilibrium, as you see, for both actors, because both would have been better off in total if they had both not confessed. They would have gone out of the scene, not paying any fine. Now they're basically both paying the highest total fine. They're paying a -2 fine, and this compares to 0 in the case of when they both would have cooperated, and it compares to a total -1 of payouts in cases where one would have confessed and the other not. So this prisoner's dilemma has been developed in the context also of the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it might also be applied to cases of cartel collusions, right? Fixing a price in a cartel where everybody has an incentive to set a lower price to get more demand. But you can also apply it to the Berlin public transport free riding situation, where everybody has an incentive to basically not pay for the ticket, assuming that everyone or the others pay to maintain the costs of the service. But you also might think about the thank you box, where everyone has an incentive perhaps to not pay and still get the appreciation for the thank you at the end. So it is a kind of logic of social interaction which could be applied to many cases. Yeah, Soviet Union and the United States, sort of both wanting to find an agreement on limiting arms, but both having an incentive to secretly develop more arms in order to gain the upper hand in the struggle. So if the logic of this prisoner's dilemma was to prevail in our everyday life, then we would never see any kind of cooperation taking place. So if you want, this kind of model is not very suited to understand why people build institutions, why they do cooperate, why they can trust each other to basically cooperate. And so we may think about different ways of the prisoners in this dilemma to overcome the problem of cooperation. So one option would be for them to build trust, right? In a way, they both need reciprocal trust in order to make the decision to not confess. They need to trust the other person to also not confess. Otherwise, they will end up in basically the worst situation for themselves. They will have to pay -2 fines, and the other one basically goes out free and even earning a benefit. So yeah, trust building would be one way to get out of this dilemma. A second one would be sanctions. So imagine a third player, right? Let's say the mafia boss, implementing very strong sanctions for everyone who confesses and everyone who basically brings other members of the mafia clan into jail by confessing. This would radically alter the outcomes of this payoff matrix and shift the equilibrium from the confess into the not confess corner. Last but not least, there might be something like a benevolent dictator who decides that the not confess corner just is the best for all members of society, and this basically has to be set in stone, taking away the individual decision power of the individuals. You see that out of the framework of rational choice, it's a little bit difficult to understand how these individuals in the dilemma would develop the institutions themselves. We basically have to invent add-ons, kind of sociological add-ons, to understand why in our social world we do cooperate eventually. So this was meant to show you an alternative micro theory of how individuals interact and how institutions come about from these interactions. To finish this lecture, I wanted briefly to juxtapose the two micro theories that we have encountered, the micro-sociological theory of institutions and the rational choice theory of institutions, which differ according to many different dimensions, and I will briefly go through them. I refer here to Peter Hall and Rosemary Taylor's much cited text, which juxtaposes these different theories of institutions. So let's start with the anthropology of microsociology. As you noticed, the actors in the micro-sociological setup are, let's say, far less equipped with information, with rationality than the actors in the rational choice models, right? So these actors in the micro-sociological cosmos are quite incomplete. They are in need of social order. They basically develop institutions through everyday kind of routines, bottom up. in order to stabilize their environment. In the rational choice world, by contrast, the actors are quite grown up, right? They don't necessarily need institutions. They just basically set them up whenever they encounter problems of kind of collective action, such as in the prisoner dilemma. Then they would devise certain institutions, such as a contract to not confess, or they might set up like a third party that enforces such a contract. So they rationally design an institution instead of developing it bottom up from their everyday life. They also develop institutions only for the purpose of making it efficient, yeah, of solving the prisoner dilemmas or of solving coordination problems, such as should we sort of drive on the left side of the road or on the right side. This just has to be decided, and we set this up rationally and efficiently. The function of institutions in the sociological context is much more to create stability and order. The way that institutions influence individuals is also conceptualized differently in these two different micro-theories. In the sociological theory, we saw that these processes of socialization, of internalization of norms, is how social reality basically acts on the individual. We saw in this very extreme case of reification that individuals may even be influenced into thinking that the social order that influences them is not anymore human-made. The way that others or institutions influence individuals in the rational choice world is basically just through constraints. It's very external, basically to them. In the utility function, others appear as a constraint on their action, right? If others think I should leave a tip in a restaurant I will never go into again, yeah, then I will basically have to price in this tip into the bill. My rational choice perspective on the tip paying in the restaurant would be, why I don't pay a tip. I mean, I would just increase my cost and not have any additional benefit given that I never return to the restaurant. But there are others present and they expect me to pay 15% tips. And if I don't do it, I basically get their blaming and shaming, which is very costly for me. So I include a tip into my cost and utility function. So this is a way that others or institutions, in this case, the institution of certain basically rules about tips would influence individuals in the rational choice kind of world. Why do individuals accept institutions and the social order? Here, the two kind of theories also differ. We saw that in the sociological world, then institutions are taken for granted. And there is a constant reiteration also of the social world, has to be justified constantly. It's questioned by new members, and the narrative just has to be consistent. It has to hold across biographies, across different spheres of society. In the rational choice world, an institution is basically justified by it generating the output that everyone wants. If it doesn't work, then it will be abolished. Meaning also that the theories differ with regard to how institutions change. So basically, institutions are abolished in the rational choice world if they are not any longer corresponding to the preferences, or also if they witness an external shock. So yeah, like a war going on, but yeah, nothing really internally through the actors themselves. Institutional change in the sociological world takes into account the relative inertia of institutions, right? Once in place, they might continue to persist even though their original purpose, maybe even their original founders, are not any longer around, right? Think about all of these defunct kind of institutions which are still with us, perhaps the monarchy, or also these rituals in universities, which don't really have a very high output sort of generating function, but which are still with us, just for the reasons of inertia, such that change in the sociological perspective is often incremental. So here are also some authors who stand for these different theories beyond just a rational choice, founders, and Birger Luckmann, who wrote this book, which I can really recommend also for you to read in the optional readings. But yeah, who wrote this book about 50 years ago. Let's briefly summarize these two very different micro perspectives on individuals, their interactions, and institutions. On the one hand, we have the sociological micro theories who start from everyday life, who look at how individuals interact and gradually move basically into creating these institutions, which then form an objective reality, right? They are almost like stones, just as social facts, feeding back on us through processes of internalization. And this is a picture on the one hand. On the other hand, we have rational choice theory, which starts from, if you want, calculating machines, right? This is a model taken from economics, taken from the decision to optimize your consumer basket, which was then also moved into decisions of family, education, right? How much human capital should you choose in order to optimize your salary? How many children should you have to optimize your utility function? So this originally economic theory has been used also to understand more, let's say, sociological phenomena, and has also been extended into understanding strategic interaction, so between different actors. In this world of calculating utility machines, then institutions are seen as the solution to problems of collective action, such as the one in the prisoner's dilemma, where the two potential prisoners can not really agree on both not confessing to be better off collectively. Instead, their dominant strategy was to defect and to confess, leaving them into prison. And institutions think about a contract that they would sign to both not confess in these situations, or in setting up a third party that sanctions them not confessing. Institutions are then designed by actors on purpose to solve these dilemmata and to increase output effectiveness, increase collective utility. Once they don't work, they're simply abolished. These are different ways of approaching basically how, from the micro level onwards, macro institutions are built. And in the following lectures, we will start actually from the macro level of analysis to basically understand why different countries, why different institutions are so different in the United States, for instance, when compared to other countries. Have a good day.